When people think of Sigmund Freud, they imagine the father of psychoanalysis, the man who explored dreams, sexuality, and the unconscious. But what many do not know is that Freud's early life was marked by both unusual circumstances and surprising challenges that shaped his intellectual path. Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in Freiburg, a small town in Moravia, then part of the Austrian Empire, today Pribor in the Czech Republic. His family was Jewish, and his father, Jacob Freud, was a wool merchant, much older than his young wife, Amalia. Freud's upbringing was not one of wealth or privilege. The family faced financial struggles, and young Sigmund grew up in modest conditions. Yet, what set him apart was his mother's fierce belief in his potential. She famously called him "my golden Sigi," a sign of the confidence she placed in him. A surprising fact about Freud's childhood is that he grew up with half-siblings from his father's earlier marriage. One of them was old enough to be Freud's own uncle. This unusual family dynamic exposed Freud early on to complex relationships, rivalries, and hierarchies within the household. Later, his theories about family structures, the Oedipus complex, and unconscious conflicts might well have been influenced by these very experiences. Another remarkable aspect of Freud's early life was his extraordinary talent for learning languages. By the age of 8, he was already proficient in German, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, French, and English. This linguistic ability would serve him well later, as he devoured scientific literature and philosophy in multiple languages. It also showed a discipline and intellectual hunger that will remain with him throughout his life. Despite his brilliance, Freud's path was not easy. His family's financial difficulties forced him to move to Vienna when he was just a child, and it was in this bustling city that Freud would spend most of his life. Vienna became the backdrop for his education, career, and the birth of psychoanalysis. What is surprising is that Freud originally wanted to study law, but eventually shifted to medicine, not out of passion for curing patients, but because he saw it as a way to understand human existence at a deeper level. By the time Freud entered the University of Vienna at the age of 17, he was already driven by questions about the human mind, philosophy, and the mysteries of life. Yet, few had predicted that this poor Jewish boy from a small town would one day transform the world's understanding of psychology and culture. His early life demonstrates that Freud's genius was not born in ideal conditions. Instead, it was forged in the struggles of poverty, in the complexities of family life, and in the curiosity of a young boy determined to understand the hidden forces behind human behavior. Most people know Freud as the founder of psychoanalysis, but few realize that before he became a revolutionary thinker in psychology, he was a dedicated scientist working in neurology. His path to fame was not straightforward. In fact, for many years, Freud was almost entirely unknown outside of academic circles. At the University of Vienna, Freud studied medicine, but his interest quickly shifted to the workings of the brain and the nervous system. Under the mentorship of physiologist Ernst Bruck, Freud spent countless hours dissecting the nervous systems of animals, particularly eels and lampreys. One surprising fact is that Freud once devoted himself to trying to discover the reproductive organs of the male eel. Though he never solved the mystery, this research reflected his intense curiosity about biology and sexuality, interests that would later define his psychological theories. In his early career, Freud published important studies on the structure of nerve cells. He even coined terms and made observations that anticipated later discoveries in neuroscience. His detailed drawings of nerve cells revealed his remarkable precision and ability to connect biology with larger questions about human behavior. Though his reputation as a neurologist was modest, it showed his scientific rigor and commitment to empirical study. Another lesser-known fact is that Freud translated several important works into German, including some by John Stuart Mill and other philosophers. This shows how broad his intellectual interests were, ranging from biology to philosophy. He was not content to remain confined to one discipline. He was driven by the idea that understanding the human being required an interdisciplinary approach. Freud's scientific path also took him abroad. In the mid-1880s, he traveled to Paris to study under the famous neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot was studying hysteria and using hypnosis as a treatment, and Freud was deeply impressed by his work. This experience was pivotal. For the first time, Freud began to see how psychological factors could manifest in physical symptoms. Another surprising aspect of Freud's early scientific life was his struggle with anti-Semitism. As a Jewish scientist in late 19th century Vienna, Freud faced barriers to advancement. Opportunities for prestigious university positions were limited, and prejudice often closed doors. This exclusion from mainstream institutions likely fueled his independence, pushing him to develop ideas outside the dominant academic structures. By the time Freud returned to Vienna, he was determined to apply what he had learned from Charcot. He began experimenting with hypnosis and later developed the method of free association, a cornerstone of psychoanalysis. Yet, in those early years, Freud was still very much a medical doctor, treating patients with nervous disorders, migraines, and paralysis. He was not yet the Freud of legend, but rather a hard-working physician-scientist searching for answers to the mysteries of a human mind. This phase of Freud's life is often overlooked, but it is essential to understand him fully. His grounding in biology and neurology gave him credibility and shaped his later insistence that psychology was not mere speculation, but a science of the mind. It also reveals that Freud's journey was one of transformation, from a man studying eels in a lab to the thinker who would map the unconscious itself. Freud did not become famous overnight. In fact, in the beginning, many of his colleagues dismissed his ideas as eccentric, even dangerous. What most people don't realize is just how much resistance Freud faced during the birth of psychoanalysis, and how he persisted despite ridicule. After his return from Paris in the late 1880s, Freud began experimenting with hypnosis and other treatments for patients suffering from hysteria. At the time, hysteria was thought to be primarily a female disorder with no clear biological cause. Freud, however, saw something different. He believed these physical symptoms were linked to unconscious emotional conflicts. Working with his colleague Joseph Breuer, Freud co-authored studies on hysteria in 1895, a book that many consider the starting point of psychoanalysis. One surprising fact is that Freud initially believed trauma and repressed memories of abuse were at the root of neurosis. This was his famous seduction theory. However, as he listened more to his patients, he realized that not every story was literal. Many were symbolic expressions of unconscious desires. This shift was controversial, but it laid the groundwork for hysteria of the unconscious as a dynamic force filled with desires, fears, and conflicts. Another key turning point was Freud's decision to analyze himself. Few people know that Freud undertook a self-analysis using his own dreams, feelings, and memories. This personal exploration became the foundation of one of his most famous works, The Interpretation of Dreams, 1900. Freud believed dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, and he used his own dreams as evidence. His honesty about analyzing himself was unusual for a scientist of his time and gave psychoanalysis a deeply personal dimension. At first, Freud's work received little attention. Many medical professionals in Vienna ignored him, but slowly, his ideas began to attract a small group of devoted followers. This circle, known as the Wednesday Psychological Society, would meet at Freud's home to discuss his theories. Among its members were future giants of psychology, including Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Otto Rank. What is surprising is how quickly these friendships turned into rivalries. Freud was a charismatic but also authoritarian leader. He insisted that psychoanalysis remain true to his core ideas, and when colleagues like Adler and Jung began to challenge him, bitter conflicts erupted. These splits caused enormous tension, but also spread psychoanalysis beyond Vienna, as former disciples carried the ideas in new directions. By the early 20th century, Freud was becoming a public figure. His theories about sexuality, repression, and the unconscious were shocking to polite society. Yet, they also captured the imagination of intellectuals, writers, and artists. Freud was no longer just a physician. He had become a cultural icon, reshaping how people thought about the human mind. The surprising truth is that Freud's rise to fame was not smooth but filled with controversy, personal sacrifice, and endless debates. He endured ridicule and rejection before his ideas finally gained recognition. His persistence, however, ensured that psychoanalysis would not only survive, but become one of the most influential intellectual movements of the 20th century. Freud's ideas were revolutionary, but they were also highly controversial. Even today, Some of his theories are debated, criticized, or misunderstood. What surprises many is that Freud seemed to thrive on controversy. He was not afraid to challenge social taboos. One of the most shocking aspects of Freud's work was his emphasis on sexuality. At a time when Victorian society valued restraint and morality, Freud argued that sexual desire was at the heart of human psychology. He introduced concepts like the Oedipus complex, repression, and infantile sexuality, ideas that outraged his contemporaries. The notion that children experience sexual feelings was almost unthinkable in his era, and critics accused him of being obscene or corrupting. But Freud insisted that he was simply describing what he found in his patients' unconscious minds. He argued that ignoring sexuality meant ignoring the most powerful force shaping human behavior. His willingness to address what others fear to speak about set him apart, but it also made him a target of ridicule and hostility. Another surprising controversy was Freud's relationship with cocaine. In the 1880s, Freud experimented with cocaine as a stimulant and even recommended it to friends and colleagues. At the time, the dangers of cocaine were not fully understood. Freud initially believed it could be a cure for depression and even for morphine addiction. Later, when negative effects became clear, Freud's early enthusiasm was used against him. This episode is often forgotten, but it shows how Freud's curiosity sometimes led him into risky territory. Freud was also criticized for the lack of empirical proof behind his theories. While he was a trained scientist, many of his concepts, such as the ID, ego, and superego, were not easily measurable. Critics accused him of speculation and argued that psychoanalysis was closer to philosophy or literature than to medicine. Yet, this same quality made his work deeply appealing to artists, writers, and thinkers who found in Freud a new language for understanding the human condition. What also surprised many was Freud's boldness in confronting religion. In works like The Future of an Illusion and Moses and Monotheism, Freud described religion as an expression of unconscious desires and collective neuroses. This critique offended religious leaders and shocked the public. Yet it reinforced Freud's image as a fearless intellectual willing to question even the most sacred beliefs. Despite these controversies, Freud remained steadfast. He once said, "I am not a man of science, nor an observer, nor an experimenter, nor a thinker. I am nothing but by temperament a conquistador, an adventurer, if you want it translated." This self-description reveals why he was able to push boundaries so fearlessly. Freud was not interested in safety. He was interested in discovery, no matter how unsettling. The controversy surrounding Freud showed not only the radical nature of his ideas, but also his resilience. He knew his theories would provoke outrage, yet he believed they revealed fundamental truths about human nature. Whether loved or hated, Freud refused to be ignored, and that is why his name remains alive in history today. By the early 20th century, Freud had transformed from a little-known Viennese physician into one of the most recognized intellectual figures of his time. What may surprise many is how quickly psychoanalysis spread across borders, influencing not only medicine but also art, literature, and culture worldwide. Freud's theories reached beyond the walls of his study thanks to the dedication of his students and followers. Figures like Carl Jung in Switzerland, Ernest Jones in Britain, and A. Brill in the United States became ambassadors of psychoanalysis. They translated Freud's works, lectured on his ideas, and established psychoanalytic societies in their own countries. Through these efforts, Freud's once radical theories began to capture the imagination of people far beyond Vienna. One fascinating fact is that Freud's ideas found a particularly receptive audience in the United States. While many European academics dismissed him, American intellectuals and doctors welcomed psychoanalysis with enthusiasm. By the 1910s and 1920s, Freud's name had become well known in New York, Boston, and Chicago. Psychoanalysis even influenced the way Americans talked about everyday life, with terms like Freudian slip and Oedipus complex entering popular vocabulary. The arts, too, were deeply influenced by Freud.